It's time for another exciting adventure in church history.
We left off our look at Lutherans in America last time somewhere in the late 1800s. And at that time, we saw that there were basically three kinds of Lutherans in America. There were the liberal Lutherans in the General Synod who were moving away from Lutheran beliefs. And then there were the confessional Lutherans in groups like the Missouri Synod who held very firmly to all the traditional Lutheran beliefs. And then there were the moderate Lutherans in the General Council, who wanted to hold on to traditional Lutheran beliefs, but still also wanted to be more open to views of non-Lutherans and to other ideas that were developing in the world. Now, as it turns out, the split between the General Council and the General Synod only lasted for a few decades. The General Synod eventually started moving back closer to old Lutheran beliefs, while the General Council started moving a bit further away from those Lutheran beliefs. And they sort of realized that between the changes on both sides, they were back on the same page. And so they reunited, along with a couple of other smaller groups, into the Lutheran Church in America by the year 1962. And they were by far and away the most liberal group of Lutherans in America at the time. In other words, they were the group of Lutherans who were most open to non-Lutheran ideas and beliefs, and who also tended to be much more willing to let their traditional beliefs go. Now, there were other groups of Lutherans who were migrating in from other countries, like Norway and Sweden in the late 1800s. And each of those groups of immigrants started forming their own synods when they came to America. Now, by the way, synod is a word that means walking together. So a synod is a group of congregations that agree to walk together or work together in order to help each other out. Now, all these immigrants only spoke their native language initially when they first arrived. They spoke Norwegian or Swedish or German, but not English. So, predictably, Lutherans who came from Norway tended to form synods with other Lutherans from Norway, while Lutherans who spoke Swedish joined with Lutherans who also spoke Swedish, because, after all, they all spoke the same language. Well, as time went on, and their kids and grandkids started speaking English more and stopped using their own native languages very much, many of those little synods started talking to each other and realizing that they were more or less on the same page. So in the early 1900s, tons of these Norwegian synods and Swedish synods and so on started merging with each other into larger synods. And by 1960, they had formed into the American Lutheran Church, which was a very moderate kind of Lutheran, much like the General Council was in its earlier days. And this American Lutheran Church had a lot more respect for Lutheran beliefs, but still were fairly open to other views. Now, there was a lot of merging going on among Lutherans between 1900 and 1960. Little synods were forming into bigger synods like crazy. The Missouri Synod, though, wasn't really part of any of those merges. The Missouri Synod was, remember, a very confessional group of Lutherans. In other words, they took the old Lutheran beliefs very seriously, and they were not open to compromising on any of those beliefs. They felt very strongly that churches should only join together into a synod if they were completely on the same page about what they believed as Christians. They thought it was a sham to join with Christians who didn't have the same beliefs about sin, or baptism, or grace, or the Lord's Supper, or any number of other biblical teachings. So the Missouri Synod was the least open to joining with other Christians, or for that matter, merging with other Lutherans, since they would only join with groups like the Wisconsin Lutheran Synod, who held virtually identical beliefs with them. But that didn't mean that the Missouri Synod was closed off from the rest of the world. From its very earliest days, the Missouri Synod was extremely focused on mission work and outreach. In other words, the Missouri Synod worked very hard to reach out to people to bring them the gospel and bring them to faith. They especially were focused on reaching out to new German immigrants. Millions of people were pouring into America from Germany by the late 1800s, people who weren't remotely Christian. And so the Missouri Synod focused heavily on bringing the gospel of Jesus to those immigrants. So much so that from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, the Missouri Synod was the single fastest growing church body in America. The Missouri Synod was also a pioneer in using new kinds of technology to reach out to people with the gospel. In 1930, when radio was the way that most people got their news and their entertainment, groups in the Missouri Synod founded the very first national Christian radio program, which was called the Lutheran Hour. And the show was basically a Lutheran pastor by the name of Walter Meyer preaching the gospel each week. And that show quickly became the most popular religious program in America. It received more response mail than every other show on the radio in its first years. Stations across the world soon started airing it too, and it still airs to this very day in countries all across the world. In the 1950s, when people started moving away from radio to get to the newly invented televisions, the Missouri Synod pioneered using TV to help spread the gospel. They produced a show called This is the Life that ran for nearly 40 years. And the Missouri Synod was so successful with both that radio show and that TV program that other denominations started trying to do what the Missouri Synod was doing as well and made their own programs. The point is, from very early on, the Missouri Synod Lutherans were very heavily focused on reaching out to other people with the gospel. And as they reached out, they refused to compromise on their beliefs. And for much of our history, the Missouri Synod reached people very effectively and grew very quickly. But of course, things didn't stay that way forever. As we mentioned earlier, Lutheran synods outside the Missouri Synod had been merging together for quite a while. There was a growing desire, almost in every Christian denomination in America, to start talking to each other more openly and to try to work toward more agreement on things that these different groups of Christians had been disagreeing about for so long. Lutherans all across the country were no exception. They started working to try to build more agreement both with different Lutheran groups and with other non-Lutheran groups. Now, this effort to try to work toward unity between church bodies is known as ecumenism. Ecumenism, by the way, is a very worthwhile goal. Every Christian agrees that it would be fantastic if every Christian and every congregation could somehow come to an agreement about what Christianity is all about and then stand united together. The big challenge for ecumenism is always two big questions. First, how do you build that agreement with those people who seem to disagree with you? And second, how much agreement do you need to have before you can say that you're united? Now, Lutherans in the Missouri Synod traditionally had insisted that you needed to agree about a very great deal before you could unite. Other Lutherans, like those in the more liberal Lutheran Church of America and the more moderate American Lutheran Church, tended to think that you needed a lot less agreement to start merging together as one body. And by the late 1960s, the Lutheran Church in America and the American Lutheran Church were talking with each other about possibly merging together. Well, the Missouri Synod Lutherans saw all of this merging going on with all these other Lutheran bodies, and they started to wonder if maybe they were missing out on something, that maybe they should also start trying to work for more unity with these other bodies. So the Missouri Synod started approaching more moderate and liberal bodies like the Lutheran Church in America and the American Lutheran Church to see if it would be possible to work more closely together. Now, that ticked off some other confessional Lutheran church bodies like the Wisconsin Synod, and it started to lead towards some very big debates inside the Missouri Synod between people who wanted to be less strict about how much agreement they felt was needed with other Lutheran bodies, and with those who wanted to keep being very strict on the amount of agreement needed. And that disagreement started to cause a lot of friction in the Missouri Synod and started to pull congregations' focus away from reaching out to non-Christians and more toward the fights that were starting to happen inside the Missouri Synod. And this started to bring some big fractures into the Missouri Synod that only got worse as the years kept moving forward, especially as some very serious disagreements about how to read the Bible started to break into the Missouri Synod and ultimately resulted in a major church division. But that's a story for another time. We'll see you then.